Shalom, welcome back. All right, we're up to Chapter 7 in Ancient Israel's Faith and History, a book by Professor George Mendenhall. Today we're going to be looking at destruction and exile of the nation of Judea, and this is what Professor Mendenhall calls the creative reform of Yahwism. Here's a picture of the book. You can get it for around $40 new on Amazon. Last time I checked, there were still used copies available for considerably less cost. So I recommend getting this book. I do provide a free PDF version of this book you can download. There will be a link in the description if you want to get it. So if you just want the book to read, to read some of the sections that I'm skipping over in these videos because I'm not reading the whole thing, download a copy of the book and you can read it for yourself. But there's a few books that I would actually recommend getting a print copy of just so you have them to read. I personally prefer reading a print copy. I've got quite a few more books on my computer that are PDFs, but there's a few select books that I really liked so much that I got a print copy of them, and this is one of those. It's a really good book, and I enjoy opening it up from time to time and reading through it. So, in the introduction to the book, Professor Mendenhall talks about how various religions develop, and it doesn't matter if you're talking about the Sinai covenant of Moses or the New Covenant with Yeshua or Zoroastrianism or Buddhism or some other religion. They all pretty much go through these 5 phases. And the last phase is the reform period. It says some people frustrated with the perceived meaninglessness of traditional religious forms become reinvigorated by connecting with the functions and values of the religion's formative or adaptive periods. And so if you're connecting back to an adaptive period, this is something I would call not a true reform. A true reform is when you go back to the formative period, because in the case of the faith taught by Yeshua, the formative period would be the time of Yeshua and his 12 apostles, versus the adaptive period, which is after Paul and his crew of midnight monks came in and started changing the doctrines of Yeshua. So if you want to get back to the true faith, you need to go back to the formative period. And so this is where we left off in chapter 6 with Yahweh allowing the Babylonians to come in and destroy Jerusalem in 586 BC. Incidentally, just to put a plug in for the next chapter, chapter 8 is the chapter of the book that's my favorite. It starts talking about Yeshua, what he did, some of the meaning behind some of the things that Yeshua said that maybe we haven't fully understood the context of. Meanings of words change over time, and so there's things that Yeshua was saying that we may not can understand just because of cultural differences or forgotten alternative meanings of words and such and so forth. So make sure you watch the next video, chapter 8. That's the one that really kind of takes it all home with what we've been studying. All right, so chapter 7 begins this way. The simple fact that we do not have to dig up Israelite religion from the ruins of the ancient world is nothing short of remarkable. From 1200 BC to the present day, there has been an unbroken line of different communities reflecting continuity with that faith. And I don't think this could be overemphasized. Like, this is true. If you think about it, and this is something I've thought about throughout my life many times, is how can this faith that, I mean, really, you could say it began with Moses at Mount Sinai, or you could even make a case for going back further and starting it with Abraham. But the fact of the matter is that either way, this religion that we believe, this faith of Yahweh, is over 3,500 years old. We're looking at very ancient documents that that have been not buried and forgotten, but they've been embraced and carried with people for thousands of years. They've been respected documents and covenants and belief systems that that are very, very ancient. Yeshua himself, Yeshua doesn't tell us he came to start this new faith. He says, if Moses wrote about me. If you believe Moses, you would believe me. So he connects himself back to Moses. So that's, if anything, Yeshua was a reform back to the formative period of the faith of Moses. It wasn't necessarily that he was bringing a new religion, even though it was so drastically different from what was being taught in his time that it became an offshoot, a branch of Judaism that eventually separated into its own faith. Going on with the text, this is a stunning contrast to the historical norm. Like the worship of the Canaanite, Assyrian, Babylonian, Egyptian, and Hittite gods, to name only a few, the worship of Yahweh, a god closely linked to the fortunes of a petty state in backwater Palestine, should have ended around 586 BC with the destruction of Jerusalem. We should today be excavating its remains, along with those of other religions, from the ruins where its disillusioned practitioners left it millennia ago. Instead, this faith endured, and living expressions of it today are no further away than the neighborhood church, synagogue, or mosque. Why did this religion survive when the others did not? No, I would attribute it to Yahweh. I think it's proof of the fact that there is a higher power that's been guiding those who have faith in this Yahweh, this creator God. We cannot attribute it to some mystical tenacity of the so-called Hebrew people, and I would agree with that too. The Hebrew people, if anything, are probably the greatest enemy of this religion. Whether you understand the Hebrew people to be the Edomite Jews that claim to be Israelites, or whether you believe the Hebrews to be modern day Christianity, or whatever you believe them to be, the people in general are the biggest enemies of the true faith of Yahweh. We spend quite a bit of time and effort creating loopholes for ourselves in what should be some relatively simple doctrines. And if we're not creating loopholes, we're adding commandments and making it more complicated, and then we got to come up with new loopholes for the commandments we added, to the point that you end up burying a mountain over this molehill of really just 10 commitments that we have to Yahweh. The biblical record clearly shows that, like anyone else, the Israelites were individuals who could be firm or wavering in their faith, and the events of 586 BC were certainly potentially faith-shattering. After Jerusalem and its temple were destroyed, many of these Yahweh worshippers, referred to as Judeans, which that's correct. That's the proper translation of Judeos. So anywhere you see Jews in the scripture, it should actually be Judeans, not Jews. That Judeans is the proper translation there. They were forcibly resettled in and around Babylon, or southern Mesopotamia, leaving only the poorest villagers in Judah. In fact, some of these exiled Judeans embraced the religion of their Babylonian captors. For them, Yahweh had probably never been much more than the divine patron of the Judean state. Its destruction proved either Yahweh's weakness or his unreliability, or perhaps even his non-existence or death. They turned to other gods more capable of displaying the power they could respect. However, the 2 generations following the destruction of Jerusalem were also some of the most creative and impressive in Yahweh's religion or religious thought since the time of Moses or Samuel. No longer distracted by an official Yahwisticism, treating Yahweh as the divine patron of the Jerusalem regime, some exiled Judeans were able to rediscover the old Yahwism of Mosaic times and readapt it to their new circumstances. So yeah, and people haven't changed. Like, this is the way things are today too. You're going to have one group who's not really attached to Yahweh or Yeshua or whoever, and those are the type of people who it's easy for them to embrace somebody like Paul, who comes along and gives like this, quote, better doctrine, this easier doctrine, or this, where it's less effort with more reward. For them, it's not whether the doctrine is true or false. It's like, this is the one I prefer. And in the case of the first example of the people there, the people who, okay, Jerusalem's destroyed, now let's find a God who we can count on not to let our city get destroyed. And so they have no loyalty toward Yahweh. So they go off and do their own thing. And the people that are left behind, the people who do love Yahweh, who are willing to rediscover this Yahwism of the Mosaic faith and not this Yahwisticism of this Levitical cult that sprung up in Jerusalem, they're the ones that are free to discover the original faith, right? They no longer have these other people, these people who want to redefine Yahweh, distracting them. Now that they're free to study it out themselves, and that in itself is what I attempt to do on this channel. I don't care about the modern day version of Yahwisticism, which is Pauline Christianity. I want the genuine faith taught by Yeshua. I want to get back to that moment where the apostles and Yeshua are on the Mount of Olives, and Yeshua ascends to heaven in the first chapter of Acts, and his apostles are standing there looking up, watching him float away. That's the moment I want to get back to. Like, what did the apostles believe at that moment? What's the true faith? What did Yeshua teach them personally? That would be a true reform back to the formative period. Such a reinvigoration of faith had been foreseen over a century earlier by Isaiah, when he realized that his own prophecies were having almost no impact on his contemporaries. Isaiah began to wonder what would persuade his fellow Israelites to appreciate the things ultimately necessary for their own well-being. His bleak but hopeful realization was that the historical forces must first play themselves out, and that true religious insight will only emerge after the false religious notions have been discredited and destroyed. So essentially, this is Isaiah speaking about hope for the future. And Professor Mendenhall is looking at it from the perspective of Isaiah made these changes, and I would say, and I think most people who believe the prophecies of Yahweh would say, no, that this was Yahweh telling us, like, hey, I know you guys are not going to repent, so here's what's going to happen in the future. This is what's going to happen to you after you're in Babylon. Isaiah 6:11-12, until cities lay waste without inhabitant and houses without people, and the land is utterly desolate, until Yahweh sends everyone far away, and vast is the emptiness in the midst of the land. The Israelite state had become completely incompatible with the religious purposes for which the Israelite community had originally been created. It had not even been capable of acting competently enough to ensure its own political survival. It is not surprising that most of the pre-exilic biblical prophets predicted its destruction. Once the Israelites dropped the illusion that their state and its divine patron would protect them, they were free to inquire into the religious source of real and lasting security, such as represented by the Yahweh of the Sinai covenant. So again, the distractions were removed. Yahwisticism was removed. So it wasn't that Yahweh or the Sinai covenant was discredited. It was that the Yahwisticism was the false doctrine. Simon Peter himself says this in the Nazarene Acts, and I would have put this in a slide if I thought about it before this moment, but there's a passage in the Nazarene Acts where Peter says that when the Israelites were taken into exile, that they were meant to learn that when people make sacrifices to Yahweh, their city is destroyed and they're sent off into exile. But then when they're in exile and there are no sacrifices and they're worshiping Yahweh in truth, then he restores them. But many people never get this. Many people never make this connection. And this is essentially what Professor Mendenhall is saying. It's like, look, this, it wasn't, like I said, it wasn't that Yahweh was discredited. It's that the Yahwisticism was, this temple sacrificial system. And one of the things I really love about Professor Mendenhall's studies in this book is that when you apply his understanding and you couple that with what Peter says, you begin to see why Peter made such a big issue in the Nazarene Acts about the sacrificial system being false. Professor Mendenhall is not teaching much of anything different than Peter. I mean, slightly different in some ways, but the general idea is the same. So it's a wonderful kind of parallel to see these two guys presenting the information and the idea behind it, the end result, the conclusion you have to come to is the same. Like what he's saying is really identical to what Peter's saying. What Peter's saying is really identical to what Professor Mendenhall is saying. There's just some differences in the way they arrive at it. By the way, in case this is your first video you've watched on the channel, when I refer to the Nazarene Acts and the sermons of Peter and these documents, these are early church documents that contain the teachings of Peter. And you can get a copy of this. There's a link in the description for a book called The Rock of a Sure Foundation. You can download that, and both the sermons of Peter and the Nazarene Acts are in there. Those two titles of those two documents are what I believe would be the most appropriate and best title for them. But if you're looking for a copy online, that's not published by myself, they're generally referred to as the Clementine Recognitions or the Homilies of Clement, which are misleading titles because Clement was just the scribe that wrote them, but they're actually the teachings of Peter. So if you want a copy of The Rock of the Sure Foundation, you can download a PDF copy for free, and there's also a link in the description if you want to buy a low-cost copy of The Rock of the Sure Foundation. You can. Essentially, what you're getting is what the New Testament would have been if Paul hadn't come along and corrupted everything. So you can get the PDF for free and read it, and if you like it, then you can always buy the book later through Amazon. All right. Between 586 BC and 330 BC, from the Babylonian destruction of Jerusalem to the time of Alexander the Great, the center of imperial power shifted from the north-south axis of the late Bronze Age, when the Hittites and Egyptians competed for dominance, to an east-west axis, where power first emerging in the east, in what is now Iran, and subsequently in the west, which is Greece and later Rome. So this conflict between the north and the south eventually became a conflict between east and west. That's probably why you hear scripture referring to the queen of the north or the king of the south or whatnot is referring to this tendency for the tug of war for dominance to go between those two directions at various periods in time. This conflict between East and West, Iran and Greece, would endure for the next 1,000 years until the East was conquered and became Muslim, set in 7th century AD. Yet this hardly ended the East-West conflict, as the Western imperial power shifted from Byzantine further up into Europe. It was manifest in the numerous crusades of 1096 and 1270. Although political power emerged quite late in the West, it changed the world radically. The classical civilizations of Egypt and Mesopotamia essentially disappeared over the course of 4 centuries, between 300 BC and AD 100. It is difficult for us to imagine what it was like for the whole complex of ancient Near Eastern cultures to die out so rapidly, including the most enduring and conservative aspects of culture, namely language. The 3,000-year-old languages ceased to be spoken or written. If one can imagine a 400-year-long period in which the English, Russian, and Chinese languages all became extinct, then one might begin to grasp the enormity of the cultural changes taking place in the Near East after the conquest of Alexander the Great. Particularly in Greece, new social organizations, proto-democracies, and new ways of thinking, the philosophical revolution, arose. Alfred North Whitehead exaggerated only slightly when he said that all of Western civilization is a series of footnotes to Plato and Aristotle. A Westerner of today, equipped with good translations, need only contrast the intelligibility of almost anything written by Plato or Aristotle with the frustratingly incomprehensible myths of ancient Sumer, Babylon, and Egypt. Even indigenous Near Easterners began losing both the ability and the desire to grasp the ancient elements of their own dying cultures. In the 3rd century BC, some Phoenicians still preserved ancient Canaanite myths, but by then they were garbled distortions of the 14th century BC originals unearthed at Ugarit. The Phoenicians apparently did not have the slightest idea what their own myths meant, and in fact were becoming quite attached to the Greco-Roman ones. Indeed, large portions of the Old Testament are similarly incomprehensible to many modern readers. You cannot overemphasize this enough. The intellectual shortcut taken by fundamentalists is to regard it mainly as a godly book of rules dictating how people should live their lives. However, this shortcut fails to do justice to the full range of material in the Hebrew Bible and its vision of what a meaningful life in covenant with God actually entails. True. I mean, that's over the last 15 years or so of my own research. This is what the conclusion is I've come to, that the simplistic understanding that you find in certainly in most churches that I've been in, I mean, is inadequate. It's inadequate to understand the message of Yahweh. That's one of the reasons I started doing these videos, is because somebody needs to make this information accessible to everyone. The Assyrian and Babylonian empires left vast regions severely depopulated, especially the Euphrates River Valley and Transjordan. This silent but powerful testimony to the suffering of the civilian population during the death throes of these empires. Although they were not the primary target of imperial attack, they became the primary victims, simply because these ancient armies lived off the land. Instead of carrying their own supplies, they forcibly confiscated whatever was available locally, with no regard to whether the indigenous population would have seed for the next planting season. Economic collapse, famine, and disease eventually followed war. So, yeah, the armies would come and just clean everything out, take all the food from the villages, and I mean, he's saying they didn't even leave enough seed for the next year's planting. Well, a lot of times they didn't even leave enough food for the people to survive the winter. There's a footnote on this page that says the Bible notes that spring is the time when kings go out to battle. In 2 Samuel 11:1, that's because the grain is being harvested, summer vegetables are ripening, and if the rains have been good, food is everywhere for the taking. But further south, in the Arabian Peninsula, prosperity and population were both increasing due to rapid economic growth fueled by the exploitation of natural resources such as gold and incense. Because these were luxury goods, trade in them was extremely profitable. The towns and states along the incense route of western Arabia formed the Ishmaelite Confederation, whose members also traditionally claimed Abraham as a common ancestor. Gaining control of this remote but profitable trade route had been a cornerstone of Assyrian imperial policy in the 7th century BC, and it is only at this comparatively late phase of biblical history that we first began to see in these desert caravaneers anything resembling Bedouin nomads. The last Babylonian king, Nabon-Idams, ruled from 556 to 538 BC, moved his capital to the remote oasis of Tema, where he could be more closely supervise the flow of this wealth out of Arabia. Some of Professor Mendenhall's comments in this chapter, or this paragraph rather, relate back to his earlier frustration that he expressed in chapters 1 and 2 of historians always wanting to connect the traditions and the culture of the ancient Israelites to these Bedouin shepherds, and Professor Mendenhall saying that's not a fair assessment. There's no reason to think that these Israelites were no different than Bedouins. They had actual cities and towns, and they had actual settlements. They weren't these guys traveling around in tents all the time like they're generally pictured. And again, footnote, interestingly, it was in this relatively isolated corner of the Near East that ancient cultural features continued to be preserved. For example, even as archaic Semite languages began to die out elsewhere, Arabic not only persisted but also retained many linguistic features dating back to the Bronze Age. So a lot of the more ancient meanings of Hebraic terms and figures of speech and idiomatic expressions, a lot of this is actually preserved in Arabic, which is a sister language to Hebrew, and in that culture. And so we'll see some of that in the next chapter. He gives some examples of it. Some scholars have applauded the Assyrians and their empire, noting that they had maintained international order. Indeed, they had, but at what cost? A recent survey of the Euphrates River Valley showed that the whole area was virtually depopulated by the end of the Assyrian period, undoubtedly as a direct result of the very policies that some scholars now find so admirable. There are people today who, like the pagans of antiquity, regard the political monopoly of force as the source of peace, order, prosperity, and security. Catastrophes such as those wrought by the Assyrians begin innocently enough when good people start to place a high value on power and affluence and support the sort of politics that seem, in the short term, to guarantee them, at least for some, what eventually results in social and political organization that increasingly defines itself by its ability to control others through coercion. I think we can learn that language by just looking at the history of America. Like, this nation was founded under the principles of freedom and security and brotherhood and we have certain rights and privileges, and that these rights guarantee or help to guarantee us prosperity. And so we had this very strong, independent nation sprout up. But over time, that same political organization increasingly has begun to define itself by its ability to coerce others, to the point now where we've got what's really sometimes better described as a police state, where there's so many laws that virtually everybody is a criminal in one respect or another. At the beginning of World War II, Winston Churchill remarked that he had no intention of presiding over the dissolution of the British Empire. No imperial leader ever does, but history does not respect their political agendas for very long. A point well understood by the Hebrew prophets. The Assyrian Empire succumbed to the Babylonian Empire beginning around 620 BC. The Babylonians reached their zenith around 605 BC, but by 630 BC, they themselves had fallen victim to the expanded Persian Empire. The cornerstone of imperial policy, then as now, was economics. The Assyrians and Babylonians were generally intolerant of the local cultures, religions, and social institutions of the people they conquered, especially if these things fostered competing loyalties that might fuel rebellion against the empire. Rebellion was defined as withholding of tribute or taxes. Any small state that did so surely realized that it had no chance of success unless it obtained the wholehearted cooperation of other states, such as Egypt, and at a cost less than the original tribute itself. Not surprisingly, key government officials were often murderously divided over just such questions of foreign policy, because it sometimes took as long as a year for an imperial power to mobilize its resources and move against a rebellious state. Those in revolt usually had time to organize their neighbors against the alleged common enemy. After suppressing a rebellion, the victorious empire would almost always execute the leader, usually the king, although occasionally he would be taken prisoner and kept in protective custody. Babylonian records confirm the biblical account of 2 Kings 25:27-30 that such was the fate of Jehoiakim, king of Judah. The tribute imposed on the pacified population would then be increased, both to punish the rebels and to help the empire recover the cost of crushing an uprising. Sometimes the victorious empire would deport any personnel who were essential to a military buildup, particularly specialized craftsmen such as smiths, in the hopes of disarming the state and forestalling future insurrections. A state whose rebellion failed could expect the dismantling of its political apparatus, the physical destruction of the capital itself, along with its temples and palaces, and the execution of its leaders, and the relocation of everyone except the most insignificant villagers. These methods date back to the Egyptian Empire of the 15th century BC, so everyone must have known what punishment awaited defeated rebels. But these methods had an enormous and unintended side effect. By resettling conquered people in the imperial home, and whether Assyria or Babylonia, the indigenous population there became so diluted that there was insufficient solidarity to maintain the empire itself, which increasingly compromised only the king and its bureaucracy. This part that's highlighted, I highlighted it because that's what's occurring in many of the Western nations today. You have this merchant class of foreigners and banksters who are bankrolling the importation of illegal, military-aged aliens, foreign invaders coming into many Western nations. And the purpose there, I think the actual purpose is to dilute the indigenous population, or the population that's currently occupying those countries, so that there will be insignificant solidarity to maintain the empire. So in other words, diversity is most certainly not our strength, and it's not the strength of any nation to be able to exist and remain powerful, and to remain in solidarity with its people. Diversity causes division, and it causes unrest, and it causes financial hardships, and so it's most certainly not our strength. So regardless of what the catchphrase is, just because something's a catchphrase doesn't mean it's true. We know almost nothing about the living conditions endured by those who were forcibly resettled in Babylon. As state slaves, they undoubtedly were forced into the lowest menial labor with virtually no compensation. One scholar has suggested that they were employed dredging the canals in and around Babylon, which were constantly silting up and jeopardizing the entire economy of southern Mesopotamia. Yet in the midst of this apparent squalor, the Judeans in exile produced an extraordinary body of religious literature, ranging from Ezekiel's breathtaking description of the Valley of Dry Bones to the compiling of the former prophets. Most of this writing, in one way or another, dealt with the urgently relevant question, why has this disaster happened? In fact, by the 1930s, most biblical scholars assumed that 90% of the Old Testament text was organized and written down around this time as a response to the crisis of exile. Of course, even if this is true, it does not follow that the Old Testament traditions about the past were necessarily created or invented at this time, a distinction that some biblical scholars today seem unable to grasp. Often referred to as historical minimalists, some of them go as far as to claim that prior to the Babylonian exile there was no Israelite or Judean community, religion, or history. They regard biblical traditions about Abraham, Moses, and later judges, kings, and prophets all to be 6th century BC or later fictions artificially created to provide those in exile with a common identity and heritage. However, it is doubtful that even the best literature has ever had the power to create a real-life community from scratch. Furthermore, these traditions simply contain too much accurate historical knowledge of ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia, corroborated by ancient sources outside the Bible, to be dismissed as mere fiction. It seems unreasonable to assume that those 6th century BC Judean fiction writers who knew so much about the life and history elsewhere knew nothing at all about their own roots, heritage, or past. But it was consistent with the spirit of times for the 6th century BC. Judean writers have preserved in relevant form the ancient traditions that were uniquely their own. As noted earlier, this was an era when people all over the Near East, perhaps sensing the exhaustion of their indigenous cultures, were nostalgically returning to their respective ancient traditions and heritages, assuming the Judeans were like their contemporaries in this regard. The impulse to preserve and, of course, make meaningful archaic traditions about the past would have been far more powerful than any desire to fabricate a fictional past out of thin air. The destruction of Jerusalem and history's apparent invalidation of its religion and its God had a polarizing effect. As previously mentioned, some Judeans were so devastated by the experience that they surrendered all Yahweh's convictions. But wrestling with the question, why did this disaster happen, led to a variety of answers and insights. Some were rather simplistic explanations designed to fix blame. For example, some Judeans apparently made a dogmatic, literalist appeal to an old formula embedded in the Decalogue. I, Yahweh your God, am a jealous God, punishing children for the iniquity of parents to the third and fourth generations of those who reject me. Thus it became fashionable to say this disaster is not our fault, but the fault of those earlier scoundrels. In fact, both Jeremiah and Ezekiel mention a popular saying at the time: the parents have eaten sour grapes, and the children's teeth are set on edge. Each condemned this tendency to blame today's suffering on the sins of one's forebears. No matter how much that might be true, for them a text such as Exodus 20 verse 5 simply describes a broad pattern of historical cause and effect and does not absolve individuals of moral culpability. Or, as Jeremiah would say, the teeth of everyone who eats sour grapes shall be set on edge. Another simplistic explanation for the disaster came from some of the Judeans who fled to Egypt at the time, taking the aged prophet Jeremiah with them. Although Jeremiah had blamed the destruction in part on apostasies such as the cult of the Queen of Heaven, that Queen of Heaven is, of course, Ishtar. That's where we get our word Easter from. Some of his fellow Judeans who formerly had been devoted to this cult and now wanted to revive it turned Jeremiah's explanation against him, saying, "We're not going to listen to you. We used to have plenty of food and prospered and saw no misfortune, but from the time we stopped making offerings to the Queen of Heaven and pouring out libations to her, we have lacked everything and have perished by the sword and by famine." There's a footnote that says something similar happened after Emperor Theodosius I made Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire in 392 BC or AD, less than 20 years before the city of Rome fell to the barbarians. The pagans of Rome blamed Christianity for this, saying that everything had been fine up until the empire rejected the traditional Roman gods. In other words, the blame lay earlier in Josiah's reform outlawing these non-Yahwist cults. Ironically, Jeremiah's adversaries were interpreting their own Israelite history within the framework of ancient superstition and polytheism. But not all efforts to make religious sense of destruction and exile led to such simplistic answers. In fact, 4 writers at this time expressed religious insights that were deeper and more profound: Jeremiah, Ezekiel, the author of the book of Job, and the anonymous biblical poet known simply as 2nd Isaiah. One example of deepened religious insight during the exile is Jeremiah's New Covenant prophecy. The content and context of this oracle suggests that it came shortly after the destruction of Jerusalem. This was when Jeremiah, who had been vigorously denouncing Judean apostasy, immediately changed his tone and spoke optimistically of a new covenant between Yahweh and his people. He said, "The days are surely coming, says Yahweh, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah. It will not be like the covenant that I made with their ancestors when I took them by the hand to bring them out of Egypt, a covenant which they broke, even though I was their husband, says Yahweh. But this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, says Yahweh. I will put my law within them, and I will write it on their hearts, and I will be their God, and they will be my people. No longer shall they teach one another, or say to each other, Know Yahweh, for they shall all know me, from the least of them to the greatest, says Yahweh, for I will forgive their iniquity, and remember their sin no more." The very phrase new covenant presupposes that the old one is no longer operative. In other words, in typical Near Eastern fashion, it presumes that the original covenant had been abrogated by its violation. After all, the ultimate penalty for breaching an ancient covenant was always political destruction and the scattering of the population, such as had befallen the Israelites in 586 BC. There was no longer any corporate body with whom Yahweh could make a new covenant. A reality also reflected in the wording of its passage. The phrases house of Israel and house of Judah seem archaic, suggesting that Jeremiah and Yahweh had in mind some covenant partner other than those who identify themselves with the former political organization. Kingdom language is completely absent here. The new covenant presumes conditions much like those at the end of the late Bronze Age, the time of the old Sinai covenant, when there was likewise no existing corporate body with whom Yahweh could make a covenant. Indeed, as we saw, the oldest poetry praises Yahweh for having created the community. Now, too, it would be persons, individuals, not some pre-existing social organization or corporate body, who would embrace the commitments and receive the benefits of the covenant relationship with Yahweh. The focus on persons above corporate bodies is seen in the assertion that this covenant's law would be written on the heart and would involve the forgiveness of sin. Neither of these benefits would mean much to a collective body or social organization which has no heart or conscience, and therefore cannot, quote, sin in the first place. Both are aimed at private individuals and are framed in such a way as to preclude the use of religion to consolidate an already existing community, something religion had been doing in Israel since the establishment of the monarchy. For example, because the law of the new covenant is written on the heart, the undelegated will of Yahweh is once again regarded as the actual determinant of behavior. As in the formative period of the faith, the internalization of Yahweh's will makes unnecessary the entire machinery of external enforcement and religious indoctrination. The knowledge of Yahweh does not reside in an accumulated written corpus of religious traditions or doctrines maintained by scribes and theologians. Instead, it is an aspect of personal character. As such, it exists irrespective of social distinctions altogether, whether class rank, from least to the greatest, or moral reputation. No one is more privileged than another to pass judgment on personal character. It kind of sounds like this is anticipating the pouring of the Holy Spirit in order for these people to know Yahweh. That's why Yeshua said he would send us the Holy Spirit and not a book, not a written corpus of religious traditions and doctrines. The Holy Spirit is there to guide us to all truth, not your catechism, or I would say not even necessarily the Bible. The work of Ezekiel is a second example of a deepened religious insight. In 597 BC, he was one of the first Judeans taken into captivity by Babylon, 11 years before Jerusalem was finally destroyed. Among his oracles are some of the harshest condemnations of the corruption of the Judean state and society. A few, such as Ezekiel 16 and 23, are so obscene that literal translations would be X-rated, a powerful illustration of his extreme bitterness and of his desperate desire to shock his contemporaries out of their complacency. But as soon as Jerusalem was destroyed, Ezekiel's tone, like Jeremiah's, changed dramatically. Even though he might have been entitled to gloat Ezekiel refused to do so. Instead, in chapters 47 and 48, he described what is sometimes called the first utopia, an idealized description of the restoration of Israelite community. While this vision accommodates a Judean government, it does not simply envision the return of the political state. Instead, Ezekiel imagined the revival of the whole 12-tribe federation in the Promised Land, the entire length of which would be divided neatly into 13 east-west strips. One tribe would occupy each strip, with the central one in and around Jerusalem reserved for the support of the temple and the Davidic prince. Since the royal bureaucrats and priests would derive their income from this central strip, the other Israelites would be required to pay taxes. Ezekiel's understanding of the actual role of the ideal king is consistent with this. Experience no doubt showed him that political leaders rarely do much good for anyone but themselves. His tirade against the shepherds, such as, i.e., the Jerusalem kings, can be compared to Samuel's description of the ways of the king discussed in chapter 5. Thus says the Lord Yahweh, "Ah, you shepherds of Israel, who have you been feeding? Yourselves? Ah, you shepherds of Israel, who have been feeding yourselves. Should not shepherds feed the sheep? You eat the fat, you clothe yourselves with the wool, you slaughter the fatlings, but you do not feed the sheep. You have not strengthened the weak, you have not healed the sick, you have not bound up the injured, you have not brought back the strayed, you have not sought the lost, but with force and harshness you have ruled them. So they were scattered. Because there was no shepherd, and scattered they became food for all the wild animals." I don't think that was directed just at the kings. I think it was all the leaders, including the priests, that Ezekiel was directing that toward. It is noteworthy that this oracle ends with Ezekiel's embrace of the pre-monarchic tradition that Israel's only shepherd is Yahweh, whose rule is characterized by a selfless concern for the well-being of others. "For thus says the Lord Yahweh, I myself will search for my sheep, and I will seek them out. I will bring them out from the peoples and gather them from the countries, and I will bring them into their own land. I will feed them with good pasture, and the mountain heights of Israel shall be their pasture. I will seek the lost, and I will bring back the strayed, and I will bind up the injured, and I will strengthen the weak." Interestingly, Ezekiel also identified Yahweh's servant David as the shepherd. Centuries later, the notion of God's sovereignty blending into that of an ideal David would help shape the Christian notion that God's kingdom and Christ's rule were one and the same. So at this point, Professor Mendenhall goes on to discuss the book of Job and 2nd Isaiah. I'm going to skip that portion just for the sake of time, but like I've said, you can download a copy of the book for free in PDF form, and you can read it yourself. I find a lot of the stuff he said is definitely worth reading. I just didn't want to turn this into another 30 minutes long video, but I particularly enjoyed some of his observations about the book of Job, and so I would recommend you getting the book and reading that portion of chapter 7. So, a vision for the future. The insights of each of these four writers acquired during the exile each answered one of the vital questions confronting the Judeans at the time. The first question, would there be a future for any religious community associated with the God Yahweh? Jeremiah's New Covenant says yes. Question 2, what form will the future community take or not take? And Ezekiel's utopian vision says that it will not be political in nature. Question 3, where can one find the meaning necessary for sustaining the religious character of this community? The author of Job finds it in a dynamic encounter with the reality of God, not in traditional doctrines and teachings. Question 4, who or what will constitute an authoritative mission for this religious community? 2nd Isaiah says it will be the apolitical outreach missions of the servant of Yahweh. These writers and their answers, each in their own ways, expressed a vision of Yahweh very different from the image of the divine patron affirmed by the now defunct Yahwisticism of Jerusalem. After the disaster of 586 BC, this vision inspired significant commitment to the worship of Yahweh, that many Judeans resisted the temptation to defect to other religions and gods. In the century or so following the triumph of Cyrus and the end of the exile in 538 BC, A different kind of religious impulse arose and soon became prominently associated with Israel's God. This was the tendency to view religion as somewhat peripheral in a Judean culture whose core was becoming defined increasingly in terms of distinctive ethnic traits. Persian policy supported and encouraged this sort of preoccupation among subject peoples. It was reinforced by the wave of cultural nostalgia still sweeping across the Near East. Many peoples sought to nurture and develop the indigenous cultural traits, social institutions, and traditions that apparently made them distinctive. For example, Persian underwriting may well have facilitated the compiling and canonizing of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible. Israelite religion became a useful tool, helping to enhance Judean distinctiveness. Ironically, this Persian goodwill reinforced the very tendency that the author of Job had criticized. Many Judeans now considered the essence and the future of their religion to be the preservation of sacred traditions and doctrines. For example, on returning from exile in Babylon, some Judeans began rebuilding the Jerusalem temple, reviving the patriarchal association of Yahweh with particular sacred place and formal set of rituals. In other words, the divine patron myth. A rift soon developed between them and the existing population to the north, who initially volunteered to share in the rebuilding effort, citing their shared religious beliefs. In other words, we worship your God as you do in Ezra 4:2. Zerubbabel, a descendant of the house of David, rebuffed this request on behalf of the returnees, subordinating these religious contentions to a seemingly sacrosanct social and cultural boundary separating us from you. He said to them, "You shall have no part with us in building a house to our God." Work on the temple ground to a halt. When Cyrus's successor, Cambyses, died in 522 BC, revolts erupted across the empire, destabilizing the early years of Darius's rule. Judean leaders apparently thought the time was ripe to reestablish yet another aspect of past traditions, the political glories of the Davidic dynasty. The prophet Haggai, speaking on behalf of Yahweh and alluding to the political turmoil of the time, proclaimed Zerubbabel the chosen one and the servant of Yahweh, endorsing Zerubbabel's monarchic, if not imperial, pretensions. He said, "I'm about to destroy the strength of the kingdoms of the nations and overthrow the chariots and their riders, and the horses and their riders shall fall, every one by the sword of a comrade. On that day, says Yahweh of hosts, I will take you, O Zerubbabel, my servant, son of Shatiel, says Yahweh, and make you like a signet ring, for I have chosen you, says Yahweh of hosts." The normally tolerant Persians drew the line at the revival of parochial political traditions such as the Davidic covenant. Darius quelled the revolts. The predicted overthrow of kingdoms never occurred, and Zerubbabel was never heard from again, his political ambitions apparently unfulfilled. In stark contrast to the earlier prophets, those of the post-exilic periods, such as Haggai, tend to link religion with parochial societal, cultural, and political traditions. As Haggai's misguided oracle about Zerubbabel demonstrates, these later prophets had little insight into the events of their own day and were incompetent when it came to foreseeing the future ramifications of current priorities and choices. It is not surprising that the phenomenon of prophecy soon died out. Over the next century, other Judean traditionalists would seek to establish additional formal criteria to define social and cultural boundaries, increasingly considered sacrosanct. Among these were commitments to temple ritual, the Jerusalem priesthood, to dietary laws, to circumcision, to Hebrew names and language, to Sabbath observance and other sacred holidays, to the avoidance of pronouncing the name Yahweh, and to the social application of the Torah as enforced law. They were so successful in this endeavor that by the 1st century AD, these traits had become part of the distinctive hallmark of Judean religion and among the most tangible emblems of Judean identity. Even today, Orthodox Jews identify most of these traits as part of the core of Judaism. Israel's God, who had previously been associated with a religious community and then a political regime, was now being associated with an emerging ethnic group. So again, it's more or less reviving the whole Yahwisticism divine patron, pretty much as soon as they got back in Judea. So Professor Mendenhall goes on to cover the actions of Ezra, Nehemiah, the Hashmonean kings, and other political movements in Judea during this period. Not going to cover that information. It's mostly history. Again, if you want to read the history, download the PDF copy of the book, and you can read that toward the end of chapter 7. It is useful history to know, but it is also stuff that I've already covered in previous videos on this channel, that period of history between the testaments, between the New Testament and the Old Testament. So anyway, that's it for now. Like I said, make sure you do watch the video for chapter 8, even if you haven't made it through all of these videos on Professor Mendenhall's book, because chapter 8 is the one that does deal with the new covenant with Yeshua, and he does bring out some interesting pieces of information. So thank you for listening. Shalom.